Have you ever stopped and really thought about the words you use every day? Language feels so personal, doesn't it? Like it's just you. But what if I told you that all those little choices you make, the words you pick, the way you pronounce them, are actually part of these huge, hidden, and totally predictable patterns? Well, today we're going to uncover them.
I mean, just think about it. Why does one person say, "It's a nice day, eh?" And someone else says, "It's a nice day, right?" Or even, "In it?" They all do the same job. So why are there so many options? It's definitely not random. It's this incredible puzzle that's happening literally every time we talk.
And this stuff is just everywhere. What do you call that fizzy drink in a can? Is it pop, soda, or maybe just Coke for everything? Chances are your answer tells me a whole lot about where you grew up. Okay, how about this one? That little house you go to on vacation. A cottage? A cabin? It seems like such a small thing, but again, that simple choice says so much.
And what about talking to a group of friends? Is it you guys, y'all, maybe even yous? See, these aren't just mistakes or bad grammar. They're part of a system. Choices we're constantly making, most of the time without even thinking about it.
All right, Section 1, Why We Talk Differently. We're going to be uncovering the hidden patterns in our speech. So that's the big question, right? Why? Why all these differences? To figure it out, we've got to dig into those hidden patterns. And you know what? There's a whole field of science that does exactly that. And that field has a name, variationist sociolinguistics. Now, that might sound a little academic, but really, it's just the toolkit we use to see how our language and our social lives are all tangled up together. It's about seeing language not as some dusty old rulebook, but as this living, breathing thing that we use and shape every single day. So let's get into Section 2, the linguistic variable. This is the basic building block of language variation. To really get a grip on these patterns, we need to start with the most fundamental tool linguists use. Honestly, this is the core idea of this entire field. And that core idea is called the linguistic variable. And it's actually a pretty simple concept when you break it down. A linguistic variable is just any time you have at least two ways of saying the same thing. That's it. And each of those different ways, we call them variants. So let's grab a classic example, one we're going to stick with for a bit. Think about a word like fishing. You can say it with that hard G at the end, fishin', or you can drop it and just say fishin'. See? Two different variants, fishin' and fishin', but they mean the exact same thing. Now this is super important. We have to draw a line between these variables and the kind of hard and fast grammar rules you learned in school. You know, a rule like use "an" before a vowel, like in an apple. That's what we call a categorical rule. It's deterministic. You just have to do it. But a linguistic variable, like choosing between fishin' and fishing, that's a probabilistic choice. It's not required. It's a choice that's influenced by all sorts of different things. And that brings us to this amazing quote from the pioneers of this field: "There is order amid the heterogeneity." What they're saying is, yeah, our language is messy and full of all this variation, this heterogeneity, but it's not just total chaos. Underneath it all, there's a hidden order, a system of probabilities that we can actually measure and study. Okay, Section 3, Finding the Hidden Rules. Let's talk about how linguists measure language in the wild. So how do we actually find these hidden rules? I mean, how do you go from just listening to people talk to discovering these really deep patterns? Well, there's a method to the madness. And the secret sauce, the thing that makes this a real science, is called the principle of accountability. It's simple but powerful. You can't just walk around and count how many times you hear someone say fishin'. No. You have to count every single time they could have said it, every word that ends in ing, and then you can figure out the percentage. It's about looking at all the possibilities. Think of it like a batting average in baseball, right? We don't judge a player by the total number of hits they have over their entire career. That'd be silly. What we care about is the percentage of times they get a hit every time they step up to the plate. It's the rate that tells the real story, not the raw count. And this table shows you exactly why that's so crucial. Look at this. If you were just counting the raw numbers, the tokens, it would look like the speaker says fishin' more when they're reading a formal passage, 10 times versus only 8 in casual speech. But that is completely misleading. Once you apply accountability and look at the percentages, boom, the whole story flips. They only use it 25% of the time when reading, but a whopping 40% of the time in casual speech. The context is everything.
So, moving on to section 4, language, class, and gender, where we'll see what our speech reveals about our social world. Okay, so now we have our tools, right? We've got the linguistic variable and we've got the principle of accountability. Now we can actually use them to see what our speech tells us about society. And trust me, this is where it gets really cool. Let's jump back to a landmark study from the 1960s in New York City by William Lubbow. He found this incredibly clear pattern. Just look at the graph. The lines show that the lower a person's social class, the more often they use the fission form. But also, look at how all the lines dip down on the right. That's the formal context, a reading passage. So everyone, no matter their class, used fission less when they were being careful. Our speech patterns are a direct reflection of our social world. But it gets even more complicated than that. You know, social identity isn't just about these big, broad categories like class. What about the much more local groups we're part of? So, for our next stop, we're going to a high school in suburban Detroit studied by the linguist Penelope Eckert. And at this school, there were two major cliques. You had the jocks, who were all about school spirit, and then you had the burnouts, who were, well, pretty much the opposite. Now, what was happening in this area at the time was this massive sound change called the Northern Cities vowel shift. Basically, all the vowel sounds were starting to move around in people's mouths. And this graph here, it shows something incredible. The higher up the line is, the more that group is using the new sounds, the sounds of the future, so to speak. And you can see it clear as day. The burnouts are way out in front, leading the change. And the jocks, the ones tied to the school and the establishment, they're lagging way behind. But here is the real kicker. Look at the gap between the jock girls and the burnout girls, those blue arrows. It is huge. It's way bigger than the gap between the boys. And this helps us solve a huge puzzle in linguistics called the gender paradox, which is basically, why do women sometimes seem to hold on to old ways of speaking, but other times seem to be driving language change? Well, this study gives us the answer. It's because women isn't just one big group. The burnout girls are pushing language forward, using these new sounds to actively carve out an identity for themselves that is totally different from the more traditional jock girls. All right, section 5 is speaking our identities, and it's all about moving from reflecting society to actually creating it. This brings us right up to the modern way of thinking about all this. We've realized we aren't just passive mirrors, just reflecting the groups we belong to. No, we are active players, and language is one of the most powerful tools we have. You can actually think of the history of this field in 3 big waves. The first wave was all about how language reflects your big social category, like your class. Then, the second wave got more specific, showing how language reflects your local group, think jocks versus burnouts. But the third wave, which is where we are today, is the real game changer. It says you actively use language to create your identity, moment by moment. And this quote is just a perfect example of that third wave in action. We've got a fraternity president at a meeting saying, I'll tell you what, I ain't gonna pay a fucking thing, all right? Now, this guy is the one with all the power in the room, but he's dropping ain't and fucking. Why? He's not just reflecting some kind of background he came from. No, he is strategically using that kind of language to perform dominance, to project authority, and to shut down the conversation. He's building his identity as the guy in charge right then and there. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that all these little linguistic choices we make are never, ever trivial. They're not just random quirks or little mistakes. They are the absolute building blocks of our social lives and of our very identities. And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. If our language isn't just reflecting who we are, but is actively building it, what are you building with every single word you speak?